Hello and welcome to Illumination Podcast with Nick and Kisma. I'm Kisma, and I'm so excited for today's episode because we have a special guest. As you know, at Illumination Podcast, we don't have a lot of guests. So when someone comes on, we know they have an essence, they have a message, and they are just the perfect human to put in front of you, our listeners. And today's guest is Melanie Klein. She is a sought-after empowerment coach, thought leader, and influencer in the areas of body confidence, authentic empowerment, and visibility. She's also a successful and highly acclaimed writer, speaker, and professor of sociology and women's studies. And some of her books are about yoga, about body image. For instance, she has Yoga Rising, she has Yoga and Body Image, and she is also the co-founder of The Joy Revolution. So without further ado, I'm so excited for this episode with Melanie Klein. Hello and welcome to Illumination Podcast with Nick and Kisma, bringing you ancient wisdom for modern day success so that you can have the mindset to get your life and business set.
As always, thank you for tuning in. And if you're new to the podcast, take a quick second to hit the subscribe button in iTunes, SoundCloud, or Stitcher. If you want to get the inside info for this and every episode, as well as some free gifts, go to illuminationacademy.net/podcasts. And now let's dive in to get your mindset for your life and business set.
Well, hello there, Nick.
Hello there, Kisma.
What's going on with you?
Well,
a lot.
Yes. Yeah. How do you know that?
Well, I live with you, number one.
Well, what makes you say that? Am I like going crazy or anything like that? Sometimes I don't always know when I'm going crazy.
Yeah, well, I would say you never go crazy, but you've been building, you've been in a lot of content creation with your energy mastery site.
Yeah, I have. Yeah.
Moved things over, and that's been pretty phenomenal.
Yeah, it's been quite a big project, and I'm back into like creation mode. Like tech mode is not super fun for me. It's kind of cool because it's a little like playing a video game, but like a video game that actually does something. But not as much fun because it's like the creative part is not so much, you know. And now it took me a minute actually to transition. Like I was really in that mindset. And now I've kind of like transitioned out and it's like, the ideas are flowing. I'm writing, I'm working on some new things. It's pretty fun.
When's your next energy mastery training?
Next energy mastery training is in September, late September, and 28th.
Okay, coming up.
Yeah,
We're recording early September, so in a few weeks. Cool.
So, and then a few special trainings, and then another one in January. So,
okay.
Yeah,
I love it.
Pretty exciting. I'm excited about our guest today.
Well, I am too. So
it's going to take us back. Remember when we first started the podcast, Kisma and the Dark Yogi?
It was Kisma and the Dark Yogi. I often wonder, maybe we could have or should have, I don't like to use the word should, but should we have kept that name? But now I think Illumination is more of what we do. But it was Kisma and the Dark Yogi, and it was pretty intense for a while.
It really was. Yeah, it was probably not the best outlet, for that part of me. Yeah,
it was fun. But yeah, so you've all heard who we have. We have this fabulous Melanie Klein. And Melanie, I'm just going to pull you on in and have you say hello to our audience. And thanks for being here on Illumination Podcast.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for having me, Kisma and Nick and everyone listening at Illumination Academy. I have to say, this is a fun moment for me because I have binged out on your podcast and I love it. And whenever I hear you two starting your, podcast episodes with your fun banter and your little conversations, whether it's about your Nespresso machine or, Nick's grilled cheese binge or whatever it happens to be, I'm always like, I want to be in the room with them, talking to them. So I am totally like geeking out on the fact that I get to be part of this today.
Oh, that's amazing. That means a lot to me. And you're kind of up the road. We're here in Carlsbad in my office and you're up in Santa Monica. Is that right?
That is correct. Just the train of truth connects us.
I know it really does. We might hear it like here and then there, but and so I kind of want to give our listeners a little backstory. Melanie, I think you and I met probably close to 2 years ago at an event, and I remember, from afar. If for those of you that don't know her, you're not on Facebook or Instagram, go find her and follow her, check our show notes. Melanie has this essence about her. She's very beautiful. She's got this long, gorgeous, thick hair, and just a look. And then I remember just having this like, wow, that's really an amazing woman. Like, yes, a human, but there was something about you as a woman that was so captivating. There was a softness and a strength. And then I found out that you were very much involved in the yoga world. And I was like, that makes so much sense because Nick and I have this background in yoga. As you know, I used to have a studio and we used to be teachers, and he teaches once a year. I teach once every 2 years. But anyways, I love to just kind of enter into that place first, your yoga history. When did that start for you? Were you young or did it come about like in college? When did you find yoga?
So I'm totally going to answer that question after I say that it's funny to hear you reflect like what you saw when you saw me the first time. I think actually that's going to come up later in this episode in terms of how do we see ourselves versus how do others see ourselves. Because that's how I saw you. And in fact, as much as people may see me as what you described or potentially grounded or empowered, I'm still a human and I have my vulnerable parts, and there are people who intimidate me. And I remember seeing you and I was like, I was feeling a little intimidated. So it's just a fun full circle moment for me to hear that. And I think it's just a wonderful lesson already for, people who are tuning in about just how so many unexpected surprises and how much magnificence can come in, and that the people who we maybe feel we're intimidated by or are, really in awe of, can feel the same way about us. And that if we can really step into the opportunities that come, we can make connections rather than shrinking ourselves. So that's sort of what came up for me. And listening to that, I was like, what a big piece right there.
I love that. And it speaks so strongly to the empowerment work that you do as well.
Yes, which is why my segues are not really segues. It always comes full circle. And that gets to the yoga question that you posed, which actually was, I'd say, one half of the biggest part of my empowerment equation, which was I was already, in my early 20s, and I had come from a pretty crunchy granola family, sort of unconventional in many ways. And so things like yoga or spirituality were not foreign to me at all. And especially as an artist and as a poet, you were talking about creativity, Nick, a little bit earlier. There is that connection that we tap into to source when we are creative. And so all of those things were part of growing up, not to mention having a very nature-based experience as a young girl living in Germany, feeling tapped into that part of my existence. And so yoga in the 90s, as you two well know, was not anything like the phenomenon it is now. And, there were no commercials, there were no ads, there were no products. And so my sister randomly one day came to me and asked me if I wanted to take a yoga class. And I have to say, as much as I was tuned into things and open and came from the family that I did, even yoga still was not, it wasn't part of like my world. It was a word that didn't trip me out in any way. And I was open to saying, yeah, let's go. But it definitely was not something that people around me were doing. It was not something that was familiar at all. And so why she asked and why I went, truly, I don't know what that was about other than it was supposed to be.
For sure.
And I landed in a Kundalini yoga class, which I always say,
whoa, not just yoga, but like Kundalini yoga.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. I was like, okay, it wasn't just that yoga was odd. I went almost to the oddest end of the spectrum I could go. It wasn't like I had walked into, a physical flow class. Ended up in a Kundalini class at this community college extension, through this community college extension program in this old stinky fitness center on the side of the railroad tracks with like outdated big fitness mats. And we sat down and, my teacher had the white turban and white outfit. And I was like, oh, this is going to be interesting. And I had no clue what to expect. And definitely it met my expectations, which was I had no clue what to expect. And we did a lot of Kriya and mantra. And I don't even think we ever got up off our butts, except maybe to do some funny jumps and things like that. And my sister and I think she was 16 at the time and I was 24. And we just looked at each other. We would giggle like, what are we doing? And yet the next day I felt different, on a tangible level. The muscles between my ribs, the intercostal muscles that I didn't even know existed, were sore. And so I had this moment. It wasn't too long of a moment, but there was a brief moment of awareness thinking, wow, so I really don't know how to breathe, because if I've never expanded my rib cage enough to actually expand those muscles and they're sore from breathing, there's something really interesting to explore here. And that was also related not just to the breathing and the awareness, but then the physical part of it was I had a very vigorous exercise regimen at that time. My mother had got me a gym membership when I was 12. That's a whole nother story.
Impressive. Yeah.
And had been doing that. But it was all related to shame and guilt. It was all related to how I needed to control my body, manipulate my body, and there were these associations around fitness and health.
And that's such a precious age for all of that.
Yes, very much. And so, my idea was always like, oh, fitness and health has to do with it, what your abs look like, or, if you're a dude, what your biceps look like, and how much you weigh, and, how, what is your waist size? There was a lot of numbers and a lot of calculations involved. There was a lot of those things. And so for me, there was this awareness of like, oh, wait a minute, my body is more than my abs or my breasts or my toned thighs or, cellulite or whatever. My physical experience has to do with my breathing, my organs, with muscles and parts of my body that I have completely ignored and have never given any attention to. So that was the big thing that I noticed right away. And then, these classes were only once a week in like 6 to 8 week cycles, because it was a community, offering from the college. And so we would keep signing up, my sister and I together. And then of course we wanted to recruit everybody. I think my parents each went at one point.
That's so great.
Yeah, it was super fun,
How many people were in the class? Was it like a tiny class?
No, Nick, surprisingly, given that this was 1996, I would say there was 15 to 20 people.
Oh, that's a lot of people.
Yeah.
Especially for that time. Yeah. And especially for something as weird as Kundalini yoga.
Yes.
Did you just say it was weird?
Well, off the beaten path. And at that time,
we love our Kundalini people.
We do. Yeah. Yeah.
But straight up, Kisma, it is true. At that time, it was weird.
Yeah. I'm thinking in the time, okay, well, anyway, got it.
It's true. But I, of course, yeah, absolutely. And so there were a lot of people there, which was surprising. And we kept signing up and like I said, recruiting people. And then eventually it just got to the point where I didn't even know why I kept saying yes. I just felt very compelled to go. I don't think I even had enough awareness at the time to understand what was changing. I just knew I had to go. In the same way, I don't know why she asked or why I said yes. I just had to go.
This is such a great story, and it's very relevant, especially our listeners. I know you've heard us talk about this, but there will be a calling, whether it's intuition, whether it's a guide from the universe or God or source. I mean, my first yoga class kind of happened the same way. I was living in Hong Kong, and one of my good friends, Madoka, said, hey, there's this really new yoga studio open in Kwai Fong. Let's go. And up until then, I would do like tapes. Like I think they were like VHS tapes with Rodney Yee, and then as soon as it got hard, I would just quit and be like, I'm going to watch reruns of Saturday Night Live or something. Like I was so not committed. But I went to this class and they were sort of like it was all Indian teachers. And here I am, and I'm with these beautiful Asian flexible women. And I'll never forget, I think it was Master Yuva, the first class. He's like, sit Lotus Style. And I crossed my legs and my knees were like pointing to the ceiling. And he looked at me in front of the whole class. He's like, what's the matter with your hips? And I was like, I don't know. Like, you tell me. So it was like really frightening. But the next day, I remember feeling the same way. I felt different. And so I think that's when we do, like, we know we've just entered a practice where something has shifted, and it's so important to stay with that.
Yeah. And, not only do I love your story because I can relate to it for so many reasons, but also it really, it's kind of foreshadowing of, I'm sure, what we'll dig into here about the work I do around making yoga accessible for everybody,
Yes.
making everyone feel it's for them. Because it, like you said, stepping into something that you knew was going to essentially be a game changer for you without even knowing why or how, and maybe not even having that in the forefront of your mind, but somewhere in our being, understanding that this is the portal to walk into the next realm, right?
Exactly.
And for me, I that was kind of there, but it wasn't until then I started searching for a regular practice. Like, I knew it wasn't enough to go once a week, and I didn't like the gaps in between the practices. So a funny story is I did land in a Bikram class.
Wow.
So
Out of the frying pan and into the fire, right?
Yes, that's what I was going to say. I went from Kundalini to Bikram. And I don't know, at that point, I was like, oh, yoga is Kundalini, like that this is what yoga is. I didn't know that there were so many different traditions and styles and implementations and different kinds of teachers. And the Bikram class my sister and I went to, and, it was heated, as most people now, that's not uncommon knowledge. Well, I did not know that. And, we started by standing on the mat. I'm like, oh, hold up. Like, I like sitting and like breathing and doing, but now I'm standing. And
where's the white cloth people?
Yeah.
And the teacher did not even practice with us. He sat down on a huge cushion, and no joke, he was taking, I don't know, some kind of cream, or I don't know if it was aloe, but like squeezing it on his feet and like rubbing his feet while we were all like working out, it felt like. And I got so sick and nauseous from the heat, and I'm sure toxins. I was like, I feel like I'm going to throw up. And he looks at me and he says, well, just throw up on your mat. I'm like, I need you to open a window. I'm getting claustrophobic. And it became like this huge trauma thing that was happening. And he clearly was dissatisfied with my performance. And my sister was like, really felt a lot of compassion for me, and yet she was super stoked that she was not the one who got sick.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Your younger sister, of course.
And yeah, she was 16 at the time. So we never went back, needless to say. And I found like an interesting place in between, which was landing in Brian Kest's class, who had a lot of VHS tapes around the time you were practicing with Rodney Yee.
I never made that connection. I didn't realize that you had taken his classes.
Yeah.
She's done much more, which we'll get to for Brian. Yeah.
Oh,
yes.
cool. Okay.
Yes, for sure. And so I landed in his class. A friend of mine had told me about it. And she's like, oh, well, if you're still looking, there's power yoga in Santa Monica. And I remember I was like, power yoga? Really? It's like, okay, I'm a Kundalini person. Bikram already was bad enough. What's this power yoga thing? So I walked in there totally snooty, kind of disgusted already. Oh God, this is going to be another thing like Bikram. And I will say, on a physical level, I got my butt handed to me. And with that, even though I was like, yoga's not supposed to be like this, it's supposed to be Kriyas. The workout gal in me appreciated the physicality of that workout. Not to mention I was really young. I had energy. I was able-bodied. I had, like it was my own angst needed to be wrung out of me with the sweat. And so that was very appealing, but it was really his very raw, very kind of like in your face, I would say rhetoric that accompanied the practice that spoke to me, especially because, I mean, if anyone knows anything about Brian, he was essentially a little bit of a delinquent from Detroit who dropped out of, I think, sophomore year of high school. And he was just very raw and completely different than my Kundalini teacher. And I freaking loved it. I was like, oh, this guy speaks my language. And it wasn't just the rawness and the street style of him that very much spoke to my own teen years and angst, but also that he came from a very heavy fitness background. He had been in the fitness industry, specifically a lot around bodybuilding in the late 70s, early 80s. And he was starting to deconstruct and unravel his own relationship to his body. He was starting to deconstruct and unravel notions of health and fitness. And I mean, he very much, if anyone's ever been in his class, he channels big time when he's teaching.
Yes.
And he's working out his own stuff in service of the group. Yeah. And it just so happened that his stuff was my stuff as well.
We ended up in one of his classes. He came to, I think it was Detroit, or it was across into
Windsor,
Canada. I was in Windsor. And previous, I practiced with his brother, Johnny, from Detroit. So there's a whole like cast yoga thing going on.
Well, everybody in Detroit was connected to either, Johnny in some way.
Yeah, because the other teachers that opened other studios had been students of Johnny Cast.
Right.
It was just, which was one of my good friends, Jason Schramm, who opened Detroit Yoga.
Right.
Oh, yeah. Jason
Nick knows.
Yeah.
Don't you know Jason?
I do. Yeah.
But I remember we went to Brian's class and it was electric and it was packed. And he was just, at one point he said something about picking his nose. And I was like, that we're like in a standing split looking down. I'm like, I wonder if he's really picking his nose or if he's just talking about it. But there is something so compelling about the realness and the rawness when they're leading a practice like that. I think it just kind of levels the playing field.
Melanie, what were some of the themes or the topics that he was talking about that just really resonated with you at that time?
Well, I think the biggest thing coming from, the big gym fitness background that had been kind of forced onto me and that I later embraced as a way to control my body and eliminate the calories that I ate. I mean, that was really my focus, was like, oh, I've eaten this, so I need to spend this much time on the treadmill. Or, I mean, it was, I had disordered eating. I had obsessive and compulsive exercise habits. And so that was my orientation. And so, the same way that numbers had been part of the way I grew up, they became part of my own relationship to body and to working out. And so for him, there were no mirrors, first of all. We had to face away from them because we were practicing in 100-plus-year-old dance studio where, for example, Gene Kelly used to practice down here in Santa Monica. And so we would turn away from the mirrors, whereas in the aerobics classes that my mom did and that you would see in the weight room, it was like, no, we're not looking in the mirror. We're not comparing and competing with other people, nor are we comparing and competing with ourselves, not from what our body looked like 5 years ago or 5 minutes ago. So that whole thing about not comparing and competing was so huge. It was like mind blown, game changer. What you mean I can enjoy physical movement? Oh, wait, this can actually feel good. It's not a punishment. It's not a way to discipline myself. It's not about, changing something. Rather, this is exploratory. Like, what does it feel like? Not what does it look like? And that was huge. And also, we weren't supposed to take our eyeballs off our mats. Like he was always so funny too. It was like, keeping our eyes on our mat. And even if we were looking up, having our focus on a point out in front of us, right? Yeah. And, having a drishti as opposed to like, what's that other person wearing? And he would make jokes like, oh, are you checking out that person's outfit? Oh, what do you think that you're flipping through, an issue of People magazine? Like, why don't you just turn on the tabloids if that's what you want to do? And I was like, oh yeah, that's what I did. I watched MTV, I read tabloids, right? I was such a product of 1980s MTV video culture that for me, it was like, what do we look like? Venerating models and athletes and celebrities. And so for me, that was normal. I had never had anyone that honestly not only gave me permission not to, but suggested that I don't.
Okay, this is amazing. So fast forward, because you're not just a yogi. We know that you're an amazing coach and you're an author, writer, and a lot of the writing you do is around yoga. So I feel like your relationship with Brian has entered a different world. Would you touch on that a little bit? Because I know you're of service to the yoga community through him and with him as well.
Yeah. And I have to say, I just got a text from Brian the other day. He was just leaving Singapore and he was just expressing gratitude for me. And I can explain what I do with him. And then I always do it back. Like there's so much love for this person because here is this high school dropout from Detroit that became just as influential as my college professors.
Yeah.
Like, absolutely.
Cool. Right.
In fact, I started going to his classes then 6 days a week, always. My schedule revolved around his classes. And I went through undergrad school and then grad school, practicing with him regularly. And what was happening is a couple of things. One, what I was starting to deconstruct and learn about being a woman and learning about the systems and structures that we live in was very illuminating and liberating for me initially when I found sociology, when I started to learn about how the media operates and frames our reality and came to feminism. That all started in 94. Kundalini entered 96, Brian 97. So those two things I always say, and one of my quotes in my book, Yoga and Body Images, feminism freed my mind, did both of them in order to really create change for myself. It wasn't enough to think or intellectualize. That was, like I said, one half of the equation. The other half was yoga, mindfulness, and meditation. And so those were happening generally speaking. And then specifically, the things that Brian was talking about, he was deconstructing and challenging mainstream culture. He was challenging pop culture. He was challenging the media. He was challenging the fitness industry. And those were all the things that I was actively learning, analyzing, and writing about in college. So together, I had the sort of, intellectual and embodied experience. I had the messages being reinforced by professors and by him. And by the time I got to grad school, I started giving him my college papers when he started traveling internationally. I would say, oh, here's my latest paper. Go take it with you. And he would read them on the plane. And then we would talk about them. And he would include it, in his classes. And I remember one day, I think I was my last year of grad school. He's like, I don't know, Mel, like, I don't know what, but I just got this hit. Like, we're going to be doing something together. I don't even know what that looks like, but that's super clear. And then fast forward many years later, he was my teacher, a mentor of mine, and yet also a very good friend. I mean, we would have dinner together. We would talk sometimes, for hours before he taught or after. Like there was this great synergy and kind of kindred spirit about us. And then, so that continued. And then when he was ready to restructure his in-person yoga teacher trainings, this is maybe 7 or 8 years ago, he called me and he's like, okay, I'm going to just say it. My yoga teacher trainings suck. And I was like, why? What are you doing, Brian? He's like, I'm basically reading them my articles. Like, oh God, stop it. Stop.
Oh, that's hilarious.
No. And what I loved is like, he's so sweet. He's totally vulnerable. He's like, I know they totally suck. He's like, and I was like, who can I call? Well, you're a yogi. You know my material better than everyone. I know almost every joke and thing he says by heart, like for real. Okay. And he said, and you are a professor, like you've written courses, you know how to structure this. So we worked together and then debuted his newly structured yoga training in Orlando in 2012. And he then contributed to my first anthology, like you said, Kisma, bringing in yoga and critical consciousness together, which is Yoga and Body Image. And he wrote a piece for that on masculinity and fitness called Like Father, Like Son. And he talks about his own father, Rowan Kest, who basically was the epitome of the American dream in Detroit, very successful, beautiful family who kind of just lost it and left and went to Hawaii and started practicing yoga. And when his mother was tiring from all the Kest boys running around town, that Johnny, Brian, and his other brothers, like she called up her ex-husband and was like, I don't know what to do with this kid. Please take him. And Brian's dad was like, okay, son, you can come to Hawaii. I think he was 15 at the time, but you have to practice yoga every single day. I don't care what else you do. that's the one thing you have to do to be able to stay here. And that changed Brian's life.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, he writes about that, about dismantling all of that and growing up with a dad who was super violent, aggressive, angry, and simultaneously growing up with these newly rising images of masculinity in the late 70s, including Schwarzenegger and Sylvester Stallone, which was very a typical post-Vietnam War image of masculinity that was happening in media culture at the time, which was trying to essentially compensate for what a lot of politicians were saying was the wussification or the weakening of the United States because of feminism and women's rights. That's why we lost in Vietnam. And so Sylvester Stallone and Schwarzenegger were these kind of like, the newly jacked up, roided out heroes who were like, okay, we're going to come in and get this done. And so we see this incredible sort of increase in the level of muscularity, strength, and violence within masculinity and media culture. And Brian, as a young man, that's what he grew up with. And so then his yoga practice was dismantling all of that. And he writes about that in Yoga and Body Image. So since he was my teacher, I've worked with him on his courses and his online training. He contributed to the book and, we've kind of collaborated in several ways, which is, one of the beautiful things, like I said with you, Kisma, it's like, I've had many moments in my life where I meet people who electrify me, who completely help me change my world. And they have been kind enough to consider me someone that they want to work with in some capacity. And I've done that with my own students and clients over the years too. Like I've collaborated with people I've mentored and coached on projects. And to me, there's something incredibly powerful and moving when we don't get into these power dynamics, but it really becomes about mutual uplift and solidarity.
Yeah, it's that frequency vibe. I get really, I'm always so grateful when I think each of my clients, there's somebody that I would go and spend hours at dinner with, if I could. It's the beauty of setting that intention. Nick, I know that, did you have a question or a share that you wanted to?
Well, I thought it was interesting, to talk about that hypermasculinity and like, that's a thing that's still happening today.
Yeah.
And no, it's just surprising. It's like, okay, here we are, like 40 years later, after the Vietnam War. And, I was a young guy in the 80s. I remember staying up really late at night to watch Conan the Barbarian, and, not supposed to and whatever. But
somehow I wish you hadn't said that, but that's okay.
But he also watched Games of Thrones too.
Yeah,
right.
But it's funny that it's still happening today. There's people like Jordan Peterson who's like he's repackaging that message in a very a critical way and in a very academic way. He's basically saying the same things. But my question for you is about this is like, you're dealing in I think in a lot of ways in women's empowerment. And I think there's something there for guys too, that can tip over into like a feminization of the man. And I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about those dynamics and it's like, how does everybody win in that conversation in your mind?
Oh my gosh, it's a big question. And I don't even know if I'm going to answer it specifically, but I will try because there's a lot to be said in what you just shared, Nick. One is, it's still here. And a few things I want to say about that is we have to also understand that, especially in the last 3 or 4 years, we have had another massive backlash that we are currently in. So if we're looking, after the second wave of feminism, or what most people know as the women's liberation movement, which also coincided with the civil rights movement and the Black liberation movement. And we also had, the peace movement. There were a lot of things happening in the counterculture that was pushing back against, a lot of the mainstream norms that we'd had up until that point. And there was a lot of shift that happened in the 60s and 70s, which had an impact, which we can all remember in terms of what parenting looked like in the 70s, in terms of, personal expression in the 70s and early 80s. And then we have a huge conservative onslaught that comes in 1980 till about 1980, 1992. And there's a huge backlash. And not just culturally, but politically as well. Like people who wanted to roll back all of those rights that had been obtained through that time. And make no mistake that, that's what we've been in for the last 4 or 5 years. A lot of people felt that, Obama was some sort of symbol of a new kind of masculinity, as well as a quote post-racial society. And yet for me, as a sociologist, someone who employs not only consciousness, but a critical consciousness, I remember thinking, okay, you're all not paying attention, because there was a huge increase in the number of, let's say, white supremacist websites that popped up during Obama's first election. And there was a lot of kind of feminizing him and saying that he wasn't a real man because he didn't play football, he liked basketball. He wasn't a real man because he was tall and thin and he wasn't jacked. You know what I mean? It was all kind of boiling up to this moment that started a few years ago, where it's like, let's go back to these very one-dimensional images of gender. Let's go back to these one-dimensional notions of, the division of labor, which is what we're in now. So when you're saying that you're seeing those images now, Nick, I mean, first of all, they never ever completely went away, but they have definitely increased because the cultural climate, the political climate, and our personal lives are all interconnected. Nothing is separate. There's no duality happening. And yet we've still had progress being made. So we can have a lot of progress, yet we can have a backlash simultaneously. And I think, so that's one part that I wanted to address. And the other thing,
as a sociologist, though, is that a natural part of the cycle? Is that something that like naturally occurs? Is this forward motion and a little bit back, or is it like a battle that's going on as you see it?
I think it's both, because I mean, when change starts to occur, I mean, you two know this so well. People go into fear. They get completely...
We've seen that over eons. Miracle healings. Let's burn the Library of Alexandria down. Yeah, sadly.
Yeah. I mean, and this is the work you two do every day with your personal clients as well, in terms of their personal transformations. People get really scared of what they don't know, what seems unfamiliar. And so, people lash out and do really harmful things and make some really poor choices when they're coming from that place. And so we really are, though, even though this is a cycle, I would say I think battle is a great term because there is a kind of peak increase, no doubt, for me in looking and studying social movements, over the decades. It's like, in looking at this longitudinal perspective, if I can be so bold to use that term, it's like there is.
I think it's the biggest word we've ever had on the podcast. Just FYI, but okay. So didn't want to interrupt. It might be.
You two have used some big words. In fact, I've heard you say some words, Nick, where you're like, "Is that a word?" Yeah, it is a word. I think we're definitely at a sort of pinnacle point, not only as a culture, but within ourselves. I know that you two, with the work you do, where you're tuning into energy and to the spiritual realm, it's like there is a ratcheting up. We're at this crucial moment where we all get to decide where we're going as individuals, as a collective, and we're really seeing that play out on so many levels in terms of media imagery, political messages, personal journeys, the environment, all of this, like that we are just very much at kind of a watershed moment, I would say, in our history.
I would agree. This will be my last big question.
I love them.
This is, I think, and a really important one too, is like when I think about spirituality and the internal work, that is all about you. It's all about what's going on inside of you and it has nothing to do with the world. And part of that process, like you described with Brian and what you've gone through with that, is deconstructing the things that we've picked up just by living in the world, and being a part of the culture that we're in. And it naturally leads to that desire to change. Like, hey, like that really had some damaging effects for me. And like, I want to change that. And so then it goes back out into the world.
Yes.
And so it's like, I don't know, like I always have a little trouble reconciling it in myself of like, really focusing on the internal work and not getting too overly focused on trying to change the world, because
oh my God, such a good question.
Destroy people like so fast. And it also, it takes you out of yourself, which is where the work really needs to be done in my mind anyway. And I'm open to being wrong about that, but that's the way that I see it. So I'm really curious to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, I love that question. I feel like it's such a good question to integrate so many of the pieces that we've been talking about, because I would say to a certain degree, people would be like, "Whoa, they're going from there and transitioning to this," but it's all related. And in what you just said, it becomes very clear how they're all related. And so I'll start with just a personal story and then go into just, I guess, more of an analysis of it. And that would be that, I would definitely say, ask anybody who knew me back then, I was pretty radical when I was younger. I was already, I would say, definitely pushing the boundaries prior to ever coming into college. I was into punk rock. I was anti-mainstream. I was very, I wore all black, you get the picture. Then when I got to college, I was like, oh, and now I'm armed with this arsenal of information. I can back up my angst with this evidence. And, I was like,
yeah, right.
Oh God, yeah. Oh yeah. I was like on fire, and it was an exciting time for me. It was super exciting. It changed my entire life. That's why I'm sitting here on this podcast right now, talking about the work I've done since. It was wonderful. I love it. And yet I got a very one-dimensional idea of how change happens. As a sociologist, it was like social change happens through historical events, through movements, through, blah, 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 all these things. It was very much looking at structures and systems. Well, that makes sense. It's sociology. We're looking at society. And so I oriented to change through the outward actions that we take and the manipulation and change of those systems, right? Get to yoga, and I'm starting to come in and I'm like dealing with my own wounds, and I'm dealing with the ways in which I had internalized those sorts of paradigms and those narratives that were really toxic, and we can call them oppressive narratives that now had become part of my identity, right? So I'm starting to unravel them. And then I had this moment, I realized, I even said this to Brian, I'm like, oh, I see what you're doing. Oh, by us going inward, something that my grandmother used to call empty navel gazing. You know what I mean? I was like, oh, you're spending.
Wow, you and I grew up in very different families.
It's like, oh, you're just going to sit there and meditate. Like, what are you actually doing? I mean, it was the antithesis of the Protestant work ethic. You're not producing, you're not doing, you're just sitting, right? And so I sometimes grappled with like, is that true? I'm such an agent for social change. Like, is my yoga practice and meditation not as connected to this as I think it is? Because for me, I immediately saw them as being one and the same.
Right.
I was like, this is consciousness raising. And once you raise your consciousness, you don't just sit with it, you do something with it. And to circle back to your question or comment, Nick, it's like that can be different for a lot of people. Activism and being an agent of change doesn't only look one way. It's just not done in just one way. I mean, you two are active agents of social change by guiding your clients through this personal work. Like, it all looks different. It's all happening in different ways in, the choices of food, for example, that I know you two are very conscious about what you eat and what you support and what you buy. I mean, I know the fancy drinks you were talking about pre-show that you were drinking, like you're very conscious and you are choosing to put your money here, your energy here, and not over there. That's all part of that larger social change. And so I like to deconstruct that, because oftentimes people feel like, oh, well, that's not for me, or I'm not part of that because I'm focused on this. And I'm like, no, actually it's all connected. We're part of a larger fabric. We're all in this together, and we all have different roles to play, and we all relate to this differently, but it's all cumulative and adds up.
Right. I love that too, about different roles to play. I think that's really important in even honoring what other people do. Some people can, like, it's not my role to do what you're doing on the planet, but I will help everyone I can to be doing their role the way they should. And I love that. I think when we identify that people have different roles and they can go deep with them, it's the collective nature that brings in that word fabric is so true.
The true diversity. Yeah. It's something I actually wind up talking with my clients about a lot, because they see, and Melanie, you probably experienced this too. It's like, there's so many things that happen in our world that are truly outrageous. And it is so easy to get sucked into the drama of it. And it's like, you want to do something about it. But I think there's a question that needs to be asked is like, well, what is the role that I choose to play in here? Is this truly my mission? And have I properly equip myself to actually be able to handle that? So it's like,
oh God, yes.
It's like, I'm
yes.
just gonna, it's like pitching a tent out and saying, okay, well, I'm protected from the hurricane. And I don't know that that's accurate. And I think it sets people up for disaster, to not make a conscious choice about what they're actually stepping into and the role that they're choosing to play in it.
Well, yeah. And here's the thing. I mean, what your capacity is. And I can attest to the fact that even though yoga had come into my life, a lot of the more very, I guess, one-dimensional, straightforward activism I was doing at the time, I did not have the capacity to continue that. It was depleting on my system. It was overwhelming. There were times where I had to drop out of school. I was, my time was divided up. It was bringing up other traumas. Like it was a lot. I was doing a lot of things. And so, I went back and forth between figuring out the balance of doing my internal work in order to have it serve the larger mission, which was my mission to do that, and finding the support that I needed, and also never measuring anyone else's contributions to mine, because we have to also consider there are some people who, if they have immigrant status or, they are in some way compromised by the system we live in, they may not be able to be as public or vocal about what they're doing. They could be putting themselves in danger. There are other people who may not have the financial means to, let's say, host a gala dinner or make an endowment, but they can share information with others. Some people are taking care of ailing parents and small children and working 2 jobs. Like what their time commitment and level is going to be different. Like everybody, we need to just consider what people's capacity is, what their possibility is, what their constraints are, and make room and value all of that and support each other so it can grow. Right. And I mean, I can attest to the fact that, I'll say it on the podcast, working with both of you individually as a side note, like I'm able to continue what I'm doing because I have spaces and techniques and people who can help me work and sort through my things, clean my stuff up when it needs to be cleaned up, and to do that. And that's crucial, which is why, as it became more clear to me, in the first few years, I was straddling these worlds, knowing that they were connected. It's kind of like I brought them closer and closer together. And I was like, hey, academics and social justice warriors, you need to have self-care practices. You need to be doing the internal work to have the capacity, in the way that Audre Lorde said that, self-care is not an act of sort of, indulgence. It's an act of self-preservation. And in that way, it's one of the most radical acts you can have.
So good. Absolutely. So good.
And at the same time, I was like, hey, mindfulness community, you also need to develop not only a consciousness, but a critical consciousness. You can't just tune out and quote leave it up to the universe, even though I'm all about the universe.
The bliss bunnies.
Yeah, but we can't check out.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's
we've got it, it's all about, I mean, that expanded consciousness, that higher way of being. It's all about checking in. We talk about this all the time. We're spiritual beings in a physical body.
That's right.
And that physical body is here to do things, and our mind is here to do things. Our emotions are here to do things. So I love that. Oh my gosh, I feel like we're going to have you back for round 2 because
I hope so.
We could be going for 5 hours. There's so much juicy stuff.
Yeah, we didn't even do extracurricular.
I know, but
That's a whole nother conversation.
Okay, yeah, maybe but I would like to know, because you do have a very interesting life. You have a beautiful son, and you love the beach. You love, just give us a little bit behind the scenes of what you do for your self-care space creativity.
Oh, yeah. I mean, you probably saw, I know, Kisma, that you saw my Instagram story before this. I took an awesome salt bath with some lavender essential oils. I did my dry brushing. I love dry brushing. Yeah, it's so good. Have you done that before?
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Oh, okay.
She even bought one for me.
Yeah. There's 2 in the house.
They're so good. So, I do that. I make sure I take that time and really, take care of myself as much as possible. And, spending a lot of time with my son and family and friends and living our lives in connection, relationship, playing board games. Like right now, Nick, the Harry Potter Hogwarts battle game is lit. It is epic. It is so amazing.
That's is it a fun game?
My God. Oh my God. Yes. I will have to bring it down to Carlsbad, but
we will play that. Yeah, I'm in. Count me in.
So we play that for hours in the garden this summer, swimming, the beach, like just like living that beautiful sort of simple life of being fully engaged and fully present with one another. And the other part is being in nature and moving. Like I walk every day. I love hikes. I like to get out. Like I need to feel connected and feel part of the world that I'm in. That is what gives me incredible joy. And honestly, it's why I do everything that I do is to make that happen and to have those opportunities.
I love that. Give our listeners just a place where they can go and find you. I mean, what I love about Melanie is what she does for herself, she does for other women, and the, this essence of empowerment is, there's so many facets to it. So what's the best way, or where do you want to direct our listeners?
Well, I'm going to make the assumption everybody's on Instagram, which I know is not true, but that's my favorite place to hang out. So even if you don't have an account, people can go to at Mel Klein. So it's Mel twice, Klein on Instagram. And if you don't have the app, people can just go find it on the internet. And there it has my link tree that goes to my personal website, talks about my books and events. So that's really the most central place to go.
Okay. And definitely look, the books we've got, Yoga and Body Image, Yoga Rising. I mean, you've just done so much. When's the TEDx or TED Talk coming out?
I'm hoping next year. That's the plan. I just on Tuesday put in the manuscript for the next book. So that took a lot of time.
Wow.
That is Embodied Resilience through yoga, which is basically healing trauma, loss, and grief through yoga practices. And so that rounds out.
Yeah, you're going to have to tour with that. Mm-hmm.
That is the fourth book that an anthology that I've done in the last, 8 years. And so I have been working with now in total over 100 contributors. And that's been a lot. So that's what I've been doing. And so the last 4 months have been pretty busy with kind of closing the loops on that, and including someone you both know, Sarah Nannon, is actually in that book, and that'll be out next summer. So that gives me a little more space to focus on the next things that are coming.
So great. Oh my gosh. Well, you're such a joy, and man, the planet is really lucky to have you. That's what I have to say.
Yeah. Well, forget the planet. I'm just happy to know you.
Well, thank you. I truly feel the same way about you. And I know you two both know that because I tell you that as much as I can. But I want to just tell your listeners just how grateful I am for both of you in my life, and how lucky they are to have you in their lives. And the fact that you take the time in your very busy schedules with all the big work you two are doing to also create a podcast, which makes your teachings accessible to anyone and everyone. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
That's so sweet. Well, thank you, Melanie, and our listeners. Thank you for tuning in. This has been so much fun. And I can see next quarter, maybe part 2 for this.
The extracurricular. Yeah. Like we got to roll out the extracurricular.
Yeah.
The listeners
all about it.
Talking about yet, but it's a really coul thing that's coming, and it's going to give like a whole different look at
people.
People, but of the guests that we have on.
For sure. But in the meantime, everyone, please go in, and if you know somebody that loves yoga, would enjoy this episode, please share it with them. We always appreciate a rate or review on iTunes, but mostly we so appreciate each and every one of you tuning in. So thank you so much, and have an amazing day.
Namaste.
Peace. Hey, thanks for jamming with us today. And if you enjoy Illumination Podcast, please go ahead and share it with someone you love. Give us a rating, review, download our podcast. And remember, you can find us at illuminationacademy.net/podcasts. Talk to you soon. Namaste.